This is lecture 116 in the ABCs of Communism series that supports the forthcoming volume 7 on capitalism in Europe. As usual, these lectures are intended to hit the highlights and not replace the chapter material. Those of you studying for doctoral exams will know what your committee expects best, and what I'm trying to do here is to highlight those things that I think are most important for you to concentrate on in the highly detailed chapters that follow in the books. So our topic today is Feudalism to Capitalism in Germany. And we're going to begin in AD 1100, when Germany was divided into hundreds of kingdoms, principalities, dukedoms, bishop-governed entities called dioceses, and free cities. On the flat-lying plains, economic prosperity was based on maritime and riverine trade of goods and commodities. Perhaps 6 million people lived under feudal, secular, or religious bosses as serfs. After AD 1100, the cities grew and new towns were founded where trade was most profitable. That had meant near feudal castles and monasteries. The cities had to regulate commerce. That inevitably meant regulating civil liberties, and several cities, such as Cologne, became imperial free cities that were profit centers of the emperor. They were free because they were not required to pay taxes to princes or bishops. Capitalists ruled the towns. From AD 1159 to 1500, the chief cities in Germany were Cologne on the Rhine River, Hamburg and Bremen on the North Sea, and Lübeck on the Baltic. Soon long-distance trade in the Baltic intensified, and the major trading towns came together in the Hanseatic League under the leadership of the town of Lübeck. The Hanseatic cities each had its own legal system and a degree of political autonomy. Germany was pioneering bourgeois rights in a similar way as would the British in the not-too-distant future in London. The craftsmen formed guilds governed by strict rules which vied for control of the towns, and a few of them were open to women. In AD 1159, the rebuilding of the North German town of Lübeck began when Henry the Lion, Duke of Saxony and Bavaria, captured the area. Trading adventurous, raiders, and piracy throughout the Baltic region had made their way. Merchant capitalists of Gotland sailed up rivers as far away as Novgorod. Lübeck became a base for merchants from Saxony and Westphalia, trading to the east and north, and merchants in different cities began to form guilds called Hansa, H-A-N-S-A. Now these traded with towns overseas, especially in the economically less developed eastern Baltic. This area was a source of timber, wax, amber, resins, and furs, along with rye and wheat, brought down on barges from the hinterland to port markets. The towns raised their own armies, with each guild required to provide levies when needed. Small-scale international trade got big with the Hanseatic League. German cities achieved domination of trade in the Baltic quickly during the 1200s. Lübeck became a central node in the seaborne trade that linked the areas around the North and Baltic seas. The hegemony of Lübeck peaked during the 1400s. Then society was divided into classes of capitalist merchants, clergy, physicians, and the guilds of artisans and workers. Paupers were not eligible for full citizen status. Class struggle centered on issues of taxation, public spending, regulation of business, and market supervision. The biggest city was Cologne because of its central location on the Rhine River. There, at the intersection of the major trade routes between east and west, mercantile capitalism thrived. The city was a major harbor and transport hub upon the Rhine, governed by its bourgeoisie. Now we want to take a closer look at the evolution of the League. In AD 1100, the Hanseatic cities came to the aid of one another, and commercial ships were used to carry armed soldiers. Visby was leading commerce in the Baltic before the Hansa and Visby merchants established a trading post at Novgorod, and merchants from northern Germany stayed in that settlement while building their own trading station in Novgorod they called Peterhof, upriver in the first half of the 1200s. In 1157 in London, merchants of the Cologne Hansa persuaded King Henry VII to drop tariffs paid in London. The Hansa guilds had learned they had considerable power when they applied their strength collectively to eliminate tariff barriers. Now they wanted trade unimpeded throughout England. In 1189, Hamburg became a free city, again meaning that it only paid taxes to the emperor. In 1226, Lubeck, where traders were required to transship goods between the North Sea and the Baltic, became a free city. In 1241, Lubeck, with its access to the Baltic Sea and the North Sea fishing grounds, formed an alliance with Hamburg, another trading city, that controlled access to salt trade routes from Lüneburg. This common market approach was the experimental forerunner of the Hanseatic League. When these allied cities gained control over most of the salt fish trade, especially the Scania market, Cologne joined them in 1260. In 1266, King Henry III of England granted the Lubeck and Hamburg Hansa a charter for operations in England, and the Cologne Hansa joined them in 1282 to form the most powerful Hanseatic colony in London. Over the next 50 years, the Hansa itself emerged with formal agreements for confederation and cooperation covering the west and east trade routes. The principal city and linchpin remained Lubeck, with the first General Diet, or Parliament, of the Hansa held there in 1356. The Hanseatic League acquired an official structure. Lubeck's location on the Baltic put it in competition with the Scandinavians, who had controlled the Baltic trade. A trade with the Visby Hansa put an end to this competition, and the Lubeck merchant caps got access to the inland Russian port of Novgorod, where they built a trading post. From 1356, assemblies of the Hanseatic towns met irregularly in Lubeck for a confab. However, penny-pinching towns did not send representatives, and decisions were not binding on them. Nevertheless, the Hanseatic roster grew to include 170 cities and towns. It established branches in Bruges, Bergen, and London. The London branch, established in 1320, stood west of London Bridge near Upper Thames Street, the site now occupied by Cannon Street Station. It grew into a significant walled community with its own warehouses, weighhouse, church, offices, and homes. There is a reference to it as the Steel Yard in 1422. Starting with trade in coarse woolen fabrics, the Hanseatic League brought commerce and industry to northern Germany. As trade increased, newer and finer woolen and linen fabrics and even silks were manufactured in northern Germany. The same refinement of products originally from cottage industry occurred in other fields such as etching, wood carving, armor production, engraving of metals, and wood turning. The century-long monopolization of sea navigation and trade by the Hanseatic League ensured that the papist challenging ideology arrived in northern Germany long before the rest of Europe. In addition to the major stations, individual Hanseatic ports had representative merchants and warehouses. In England, this happened in Boston, Bristol, Bishop's Lynn, Hull, Ipswich, Norwich, Yarmouth, and York. The League imported timber, furs, resin, flax, honey, wheat, and rye from the east to Flanders and England, cloth and manufactured goods being exported. Copper and iron ore and herring came south from Sweden. German colonists in the 1100s and 1200s settled in towns and cities on and near the coast, or on and near the East Baltic coast, such as Elbing, Thorn, Tallinn, Riga, and Tartu, that became members of the Hanseatic League. Most were granted Lubeck law, named for the most prominent town of the League. This was business law that provided that they had to appeal in all legal matters to Lubeck's city council. The Livonian Confederation incorporated the modern-day Estonia and parts of Latvia and had its own Hanseatic parliament. All of its major towns became members of the Hanseatic League. The language of trade was Middle Low German. The League had a fluid structure, but its members shared some characteristics. Most of the Hansa cities either started as independent cities or gained independence through the collective bargaining power of the League. The Hanseatic free cities paid taxes only to the Holy Roman Emperor. Another similarity involved the city's strategic locations along trade routes. At the height of its power in the late 1300s, the merchants of the Hanseatic League used their economic influence and, when necessary, their military might. Trade routes required protection, and the armed warships of the League influenced imperial policy. Accordingly, the League wielded power abroad. And between 1361 and 1370, the League waged war against Denmark. In 1368, Hanseatic towns in the Confederation of Cologne sacked Copenhagen and Helsingborg and forced the King of Denmark to grant the League 15% of the profits from Danish trade in 1370. Consequently, the League had a trade monopoly in Scandinavia, and this favorable treaty marked the height of Hanseatic power. Between 1392 and 1440, the seaborne trade of the League faced danger from raids of the Victual brothers and their descendants. Therefore, the Hanse waged a vigorous campaign against pirates. In 1392, Albert of Mecklenburg, King of Sweden, hired privateers to use against Margaret I, Queen of Denmark. In the 1400s, tensions between the Prussian region and Lubeck increased. Lubeck was dependent on its central role in the League. It was at the entrance of the land route to Hamburg that could only be bypassed by sea. Prussia's interest was the export of bulk products like grain and timber, which were very important for England, the Low Countries, and later to Spain and Italy. In 1438 to 1441, the merchants of Amsterdam won a war for free access to the Baltic and broke the Hanseatic monopoly. As an essential part of protecting their investment in ships and their cargoes, the League trained pilots and erected lighthouses. Most foreign cities confined the Hanseatic traders to certain trading areas and to their own trading posts. Many local merchants and nobles envied the power of the League and seldom interacted with them except when doing business. In London, local merchants constantly argued for revocation of Hanse privileges, and the refusal of the Hanse to offer reciprocal arrangements to their English counterparts exacerbated that tension. In 1454, the year of the marriage of Elizabeth of Austria to the Jagiellonian king, the towns of the Prussian Confederation rose up against the dominance of the Teutonic Order and asked Casimir IV, King of Poland, for help. Danzig, or what is today Gdansk, Thorn, and Elbing became part of the Kingdom of Poland. Poland was supported by the Holy Roman Empire through family connections and gave military assistance under the Habsburgs. Krakow, then the capital of Poland, had a loose association with the League. After 1466, the lack of customs borders on the Vistula River assisted in increasing Polish grain exports, those being transported to the sea down the Vistula River. That trade went from 9,100 tons per year in the late 1400s to over 180,000 tons in the 1600s. The Hanse League dominated maritime grain trade made Poland one of the main areas of its activity, helping Danzig to become the largest city of the League. In 1474, King Edward IV of England confirmed the League's privileges in the Treaty of Utrecht, thanks to the cash he received from the League in the War of the Roses. In 1478, Ivan III, the Grand Prince of Moscow, ended the entrepreneurial independence of the League's Novgorod trading post, closing it completely in 1494. In 1478, Ivan III, Grand Prince of Moscow, ended that entrepreneurial independence, and in 1492 double entry bookkeeping was invented in Italy and brought to the League thereafter. Previously in the Hanse economy, silver coins had to change hands rather than bills of exchange. A major economic advantage for the Hanse was its control of the shipbuilding market in Lubeck and Danzig. The Hanse sold ships everywhere in Europe, including in Italy. They drove out the Dutch because Holland wanted to favor Bruges, as a huge staple market at the end of a trade route. When the Dutch became competitors of the League in shipbuilding, the Hanse tried to stop the flow of shipbuilding technology from Hanseatic towns to Holland. However, they had no more luck at this than the Brits had had in stopping the flow of technology to New England. Danzig, a trading partner of Amsterdam, attempted to forestall the decision. Dutch ships sailed to Danzig to take grain from the city directly, to the dismay of Lubeck. Hollanders circumvented the Hanseatic towns by trading directly with North German princes in non-Hanseatic towns. Dutch freight costs were much lower than those of the League, and the Hanse were excluded as middlemen. When Bruges, Antwerp, and Holland all became part of the Duchy of Burgundy, their capitalists tried to take over the monopoly of trade from the Hanse, and the staples market for Bruges was transferred to Amsterdam. The Dutch merchant caps aggressively and successfully challenged the League. Hanseatic cities in Prussia, Livonia, supported the Dutch against the core cities of the Hanse in northern Germany. After several naval wars between Burgundy and the Hanseatic fleets, Amsterdam became the leading port for Polish and Baltic grain from the late 1400s onwards. The Dutch regarded Amsterdam's grain trade as the, quote, mother of all trades, unquote. Nuremberg, in Franconia, developed an overland route to sell formerly League monopoly products from Frankfurt via Nuremberg and Leipzig to Poland and Russia. These German capitalists traded Flemish cloth and French wine in exchange for grain and furs from the east. The League profited from the Nuremberg trade and allowed Nurembergers to settle in Hanseatic towns. The Franconians took advantage of this right by taking over trade with Sweden, and the Nuremberger merchant capitalist Albrecht Moldenhaur was developing the trade with Sweden and Norway. His sons, Wolf Moldenhaur and Burghart Moldenhaur, established themselves in Bergen and Stockholm, becoming leaders of the local Hanseatic activities. And this brings us to Martin Luther and the capitalist ideology in Germany. In AD 1500, any argument for capitalism in Europe had to be advanced within the context of knowledge as it had then evolved, or one might say lack of knowledge, depending on your viewpoint. At any rate, in Germany, it would have to be a product of tortuous reasoning within the rigid constraints of Roman Catholicism. The things that mattered were, 1, getting a freely moving population that could become proletarians, legally able to sell their labor power on a market of capitalist employers. And 2, it mattered that acquisition of wealth by employers and workers was no longer looked down upon, but was actually encouraged. To get to these essentials within the confines of Catholicism was not possible. The Pope's church was totally invested in the feudal order. Thus, a wrecking ball would have to be used on the edifice of papism, and it came in the form of a German professor Catholic priest named Martin Luther. In 1517, Luther tacked his famous 95 Theses to the front door of the All Saints Church in Wittenberg. He was guaranteed excommunication when the Pope read these Theses, article number 86. It said, quote, "Why does the Pope, whose wealth today is greater than the wealth of the richest classes, build the Basilica of St. Peter with the money of poor believers rather than with his own money?" Question mark, unquote. Luther challenged the entire idea that one could buy his way out of purgatory or hell by paying the Pope and or his agents a fee. He did not challenge the ideas of feudal authority over the common herd, however, so his appeal was to kings and nobles who did not want to pay the Pope anything at all from their treasure for any reason. Thus the idea that gathering money was not a sin was satisfied. Luther went on to emphasize the godliness of hard work as preached in the Holy Bible that was newly translated to German and mass-produced. This document had heretofore been the exclusive property of the Pope and his agents, in actual text and certainly in interpretation. As any literate nobleman knew, this old book of Jewish fairy tales could be interpreted any way you liked, and they liked Luther's way, as far as not having to pay the Pope a goddamn shilling, and these challenges went a long way toward ideologically preparing serfs to the limited degree necessary for them to become proletarians. If there was to be a population moving freely and selling their labor as a socially acceptable route to salvation, then there had to be a new view of salvation. Protestants began to look for other ways to salvation. Calvin taught predestination, saying God chose some people for salvation and others for damnation. You would know if you were chosen for salvation. Thus, self-confidence took the place of priestly assurance of God's grace. Worldly success became one measure of that self-confidence. The capitalist acquiring wealth as a farmer or industrial factory owner was one obvious way. Others acquiring a decent living as tenant farmers or proletarians could share in this divine light of approval too. A vocation from God was no longer limited to the clergy or church, but applied to any occupation or trade. Luther, by this seemingly tortuous route, had satisfied the needs of the capitalist stage for an ideology that approved and encouraged proletarians and capitalists as God's world order. Now back at the Ponderosa, in 1567, a Hanseatic League agreement confirmed previous obligations and rights of League members, such as common protection and defense against enemies, and the Prussian cities of Thorn, Elbing, Königsberg, Riga, and Tartu also signed. When pressed by the King of Poland and Lithuania, Danzig remained neutral, not allowing ships sailing to Poland into its territory. They had to anchor somewhere else, such as Puck. In 1597, in her cleanup after victory against Spain in 1588, Queen Elizabeth I of England expelled the League, and the next year their steel yard closed. Which brings us to the dawn of the capitalist stage. In 1782, textiles became the first to experience the mechanization, when the first spinning machine in Germany was built in Chemnitz. From then on, Chemnitz continued to build machines that made it into an engineering center. In 1784, the first textile factory was built in Ratingen, Dusseldorf, that copied the factory system in Cromford that Richard Arkwright developed, and we discussed in Volume 1. British skills also contributed to the development of the German textile industry. The Cockerell brothers, British descent industrialists, built mills in Brandenburg. English craftsmen also built power looms for the Machenwollen-Werberei firm in Silesia. The growth of the textile industry led to the rise of textile centers like Aachen, famous for its thread, and Krefeld, famous for its silk, and Saxony and Silesia. After 1815, only the major ports of Bremen and Hamburg had clear and secure access to the North Sea. Even so, it did not have clear access to the trade routes in the Atlantic. In addition, remaining pre-Napoleonic feudal institutions hampered growth in agriculture and industry. The reactionaries at the Congress of Vienna thought they had killed so many farmers in the Napoleonic Wars that they could reintroduce serfdom. Once free farmers were now obliged to pay their overlord and landlords a share of their harvest and their labor. Now that could not last, but for the moment it put a brake on German capitalism. Guilds controlled many industries, and their licensing policy meant establishing factories was not easy for would-be capitalists. The local German textile industry faced competition when the victorious capitalists lifted Napoleon's continental system that had blocked the entry of cheap British textiles. Prussia controlled major manufacturing towns, coal fields, and trade routes, and the Prussian government wanted economic progress. In 1817, a depression followed when agricultural production dropped significantly. Yet Germany's biggest obstacle to industrial revolution was its political mechanics. In 1818, Prussia moved immediately to counter the problems arising from the post-Napoleonic era. Prussia imposed a new tariff system. Many hailed the Prussian tariff of 1818 as a progressive and a great incentive for industrial growth. It removed duties to raw material, but imposed tariffs on imported manufacturing goods and overseas colonial goods. It also removed the tolls or customs region system, allowing free trade among provinces, resulting in an easier and wider distribution and transportation of goods and services. In order to cure the depression that started in 1817 and control its war debts, the government borrowed money from the Rothschilds in 1818 and 1822. From 1825 to 1830, the growth of Prussia as an industrial country progressed under Finance Minister Adolf von Motz. He reformed the tax system and sold crown lands, stimulating the economy by improving infrastructure through public works. And from 1830 to 1845, Christian Peter Wilhelm Booth, as the head of the Department of Trade and Industry, organized a technical commission that monitored industrial development. He established the Berlin Technical Institute to lead research in science and technology, and it had an active role in the industrial growth of Prussia. This encouraged many of the other German states to support industry and promote a self-reliant economy by providing incentives and subsidies via the Zollverein Customs Union. The Zollverein, by providing incentives and subsidies via the Zollverein Customs Union, originated in the Prussian tariff of 1818, becoming a full customs union and the catalyst for German unification. That 1818 tariff became the basis for Prussia to enter commercial treaties with neighboring German states in order to form that customs union. By 1834, Prussia had formally created the Zollverein Customs Union that provided these new opportunities for industry. It opened a wider market for commodity products and new sources of raw materials. Without the Zollverein, an industrialized and unified Germany could not exist. Other financial institutions and cartels assisted the industrial growth of Prussia and the rest of the German states. Banks provided capital and investments to new companies. They also helped new companies to sell stocks of shares in order to form capital. Cartels, on the other hand, provided protection and stability. In other countries, like Great Britain and the United States, they negatively viewed cartels for their anti-competitive and unfair business practices. However, in Germany, cartels were considered needed providers of stability for the growth of small supportive industries by eliminating self-destructing price wars. And cartels provided protection in case of price fluctuations and the entry of foreign competition. And then, in the case of iron, Germany had the natural resources required to start an industrial revolution. Large coal reserves were located in the Saar, Ruhr, Upper Silesia, and Saxony. Iron was deposited in Erzgebirge and the Harz Mountains and Upper Silesia. In 1796, the first coke blast furnace began operating in Gleichwitz in Upper Silesia. In 1802, another coke blast furnace began operating in Königsschutt. The number of blast furnaces using coke rose up to 30 by 1850. In 1834, after the establishment of the Zollverein, Silesia found competition in the Ruhr region. Its iron deposits led to the growth of that industry. In 1849, the first coke smelting facility began operation in the Frederick William Iron Works in Mulheim of the Ruhr region. The introduction of the puddling method of making iron resulted in the increase in iron production. Foreign investment then took part in the development of the Ruhr area. William Thomas Mulvaney was one of the successful foreign investors in the Ruhr area. Irish by birth, he, along with Irish investors, opened mines in the Ruhr using the latest technology in mining. By the 1850s, the regions of Westphalia, Rhineland, and Saar experienced growth in their iron production from 46,000 tons of iron produced in 1810 to 529,000 tons by 1850. In 1866, Mulvaney added to his mines and ironworks with the Prussian Mining and Ironworks Company. And then in the case of steam, you see we're going through the 5 essential elements of the original Industrial Revolution. Steam engines contributed to the industrial development of Germany. Steam engines powered textile mills. Steam engines pumped out water in iron mines, making the extraction of the ore easier. It allowed the increase in the number of factories operating, most especially in Prussia. From 419 in 1837, that number grew to 1,444 in 1849. Besides factories and sources of power, steam also changed trade by allowing riverine tugboats to carry bigger loads and transport goods faster. The Defiance, the first steamship in Germany, sailed on the River Rhine and was followed by the launching of Caledonia in 1817. This type of ship allowed the rise of industrial regions like the Ruhr, and German ships could engage in the Atlantic trade. Steam provided the power that drove the Industrial Revolution in Germany. Of course, the steam engine led to an increase in the demand for coal. Aachen, Saarland, Ruhr, Silesia, and Saxony became centers of coal mining. In addition, the use of steam-driven tugboats led also to increased demand for coal. From just 1 million tons of coal in 1820, production grew to over 6 million by 1850. And then the railroads. In December of 1835, the first railroad line operated between Nuremberg and Fürth. In 1839, another line connected Dresden and Leipzig. Capitalists took the initiative in constructing the railroads. However, when capital was hard to come by, the governments intervened and some nationalized the industry. In Prussia, the government engaged with capitalists in sharing the risk to construct farther-reaching networks of railroads into smaller communities. In 1842, the Prussian government created a railway fund to finance railroad construction. Initially, German capitalists imported locomotives from Britain or Belgium. Soon they began to produce their own in Berlin, and Munich. Borsig became one of the successful locomotive producing firms in Berlin. In the 1840s, major cities in Germany had been connected by railroads. In Prussia, Berlin became a center of the railroad network. In 1848, the railroad that connected Cologne and Minden was instrumental in developing the Ruhr industrial region. Railroads connected the members of the Zollverein, making commerce explode. Telegraphy naturally followed the railroad, as did tourism. Fast transportation revolutionized transportation in the Prussian army, as mobilization became easier and faster, as proven during Prussia's war in Austria, during the 7 Weeks' War, and later in the Franco-Prussian War. In 1870, Germany had 11,600 miles of railroad, from just 3,638 miles 20 years earlier in 1850. Until 1871, Germany was a conglomeration of states, with Prussia the biggest. Trade had been hemmed in by a multitude of tariffs, making the circulation of raw materials to factories difficult, not to mention the redistribution of commodities produced in those factories. Germany had to be unified and internal tariffs abolished to become a national powerhouse, as the United States and the UK were becoming. In 1871, Prussia finally united Germany. It then marked the new phase of Germany's Industrial Revolution, and by then Germany could now direct its economy under one direction, and goods finally had a large market. In addition, the provinces of Alsace and Lorraine that Germany took from France gave Germany even more natural resources needed for industrialization. Heavy industry grew and developed after the German unification. Steel production rose. Alfred Krupp had made a living out of producing steel when it was a small business. When the Bessemer process made possible the mass production of steel at cheaper prices, Krupp and Hirsch became millionaires. In 1879, steel was a booming industry because the Thomas method allowed the use of phosphoric iron in making steel, as we discussed in Volume 1. Steel weapons, manufacturing, and shipbuilding followed. Krupp became well known for its artillery. With the dawn of this second industrial revolution, Germany surpassed the UK as the most industrialized country and was competing with the United States. In electrical machinery, Germany offered companies like Siemens and Emil Rathenschell's General Electric Company, AEG in German. In chemical, Germany showed its scientific skills and led the production of potassium salt, dyes, pharmaceutical products, and synthetics. Chemical fertilizer increased agricultural production. Germany also controlled 90% of the dye production worldwide. Companies like Bayer and Hocht led Germany's chemical industry, and Germany became a leader in automobile production when its first cars were made. Daimler and Benz became the most popular brands in Germany and the world. Germany imposed high tariffs against imports to protect local industries, allowing them to flourish. It also provided government subsidies for some businesses, and education played its role. For decades, Prussia and many other German states had invested in technical schools that produced great inventors. Therefore, by the time of the Second Industrial Revolution, Germany had a huge supply of talented and skilled technicians. And that brings us to a close of this lecture, and we're going to move on in the next one to Capitalism Emerges from Feudalism in the United Kingdom.